Dor, hindi ka magaling na. Kay may best nga. Para makapulis man ang mumika, may klase. Antayan mo, Dor, kay may best nga. Hindi ko makaya nga ako pa makuan diyo. Now, let's take up chapter 5 for the learning objectives. Recognize the differences between job order and process cost accounting systems. Compute unit cost in a process cost system. Assign cost to inventories using equivalent units of production with the average cost method. Prepare a cost production summary and journal entries for one department with no beginning inventory. Prepare a cost production summary and journal entries for one department with beginning inventory. Prepare a cost production summary and journal entries for multiple departments with no beginning inventory. Prepare a cost production summary and journal entries for multiple departments with beginning inventory. Prepare a cost production summary with a change in prior departments unit transfer cost. Now, for the comparison of basic cost systems, a job order cost system is appropriate when differentiated products or services are provided on a special order basis. So, on a special order basis, the focal point of a job order cost system is the job. So, take note that we have the job as the focal point. A process cost system is used when goods or services of a similar nature are provided. The focus of a process cost system is the cost center to which costs are assigned. Now take note that in job order cost system, the focus is the job, whereas in a process cost system, the focus is the cost center to which costs are assigned. The primary objectives are to compute the unit cost of the products completed and the cost to be assigned to the ending work in process inventory. Materials and labor cost. Under a price cost system, the cost of materials and labor are charged directly to the departments in which they are incurred. Indirect materials that cannot be directly associated with a particular department are charged to factory overhead. The focus of the process cost system is the factory cost center. Product cost in a process cost system. The unit cost in each department is calculated by dividing the total cost charged to the department by the number of units produced during the period. The total cost of each unit finished equals the combined unit cost of all departments used in the manufacture of the product. Products accumulate costs as they pass through each successive production department. Departments record costs according to the following procedure. The cost of materials, labor, and factory overhead directly identifiable with a department are charged to the department. The cost of the factory services departments are allocated to the production departments. The costs added by prior production departments are carried over to successive departments. Product cost in a process cost system. Production process and cost flows. Material requisitions, reconstituted vegetable juice blend, reconstituted fruit juices. Now it will lead to production cost assigned to formulating department. We compute for the total production cost, number of liters produced, and the cost per liter in formulating departments. Then we have the labor time records, direct labor of assembly line workers will go to production cost assigned to formulating department. Then we have the factory overhead applied, indirect materials, indirect labor, depreciation, factory and equipment, and etc. Now, for materials requisitions, examples, we have plastic bottles, we have cups, packing materials, will go to production cost assigned to bottling department. So meaning from formulating department to bottling department, the labor time records, direct labor of butlers, factory overhead applied, indirect materials, indirect labor, and more. Then we have the transferred in cost from formulating the production cost in bottling, total production cost. Then we have the 2-liter bottles produced cost per 2-liter bottle transferred to finished goods. Now we have the product as jumbo juice. Work in process inventories. The primary problem in inventory costing is the allocation of total cost between units finished during the period and units still in process at the end of the period. The calculation of the degree of completion of unfinished work in process presents one of the most important and difficult challenges in process costing. A factory will have units in varying stages of completion. Units started in a prior period and completed during the current period. Units started and finished during the current period. Units started during the current period but not finished by the end of the period. Allocating total cost. Total cost must be allocated between units finished during the period, units still in process at the end of the period. Two procedures are commonly used for assigning cost: average cost method and first in, first out method. Equivalent production represents the number of whole units that could have been completed during a period given amount of work that was performed. Stage of completion represents the fraction of percentage of materials, labor, and overhead cost of a completed unit that has been applied to goods that have not been completed by the end of the month. Now, in short, when we talk about equivalent production, it means converting a company's production in terms of finished units. So, converting or translating a company's production in terms of completed units. So, in this case, if you say that there are 2 units, all one half completed, so meaning each of the 2 units is only one half completed. So one half and one half. But if you convert the units into its equivalent production, the 2 units, each one half completed, the equivalent production of the 2 units is 1 unit. So meaning 2 units, one half completed, no? So 2 units, one half completed. So 1 unit, meaning one half completed, and another 1 unit, one half completed. So we can say that the equivalent production is 1. That means converting the units, the unfinished units will be converted to its equivalent production. Now, a production report shows the following: number of units in the beginning work in process, number of units completed, number of units in the ending work in process, and their estimated stage of completion. Calculation of equivalent units. So we have, yeah, anyway, we will have problem to demonstrate how equivalent units is computed. So we have now the cost production summary in one department, the reporting of production and related costs in each department involves the following: accumulating costs for which the department is accountable, calculating equivalent production for the period, computing the unit cost for the period, summarizing the disposition of the production cost. Now, cost production summary for multiple departments. When there is more than one department, it is necessary to keep separate control accounts in the general ledger for the recording the cost of operating each department. A cost production summary must be prepared for each department along with separate journal entries to record the operations of each department and the transfer of cost. Now, in multiple departments, costs accumulated in each department are transferred to the next department in the production cycle. The transferred units and the related costs are treated as completed units in the one department and as raw materials in the next department. Now, the transferred in costs and units from the prior department are not included in the calculation of unit cost and equivalent units on the next department's cost of production summary. If there is still another department, the first department's cost must be considered in transferring costs to the next department. The first department's costs are also considered in the costing of the ending work in process inventory in the second department. Changes in prior departments unit transfer cost. A prior department's transfers from two different periods will often have different unit costs each month. The previous department cost must be averaged as separate grouping so that these transferred in costs can be properly allocated to the products being produced in the department. Okay, now will you have this? We are going to involve problems in here. I'm going to discuss the different problems in connection with chapter 5. So let's begin now with exercises. We are going to take up several exercises. So by tomorrow, I'm going to lecture by using more problems. So at least you will be knowledgeable with regards to the problems in connection with process cost system. Okay, now in our problem, let's begin with exercise 5-1. Exercise 5-1 involving a determination of completed units or equivalent production. Okay, so we have now the problem here, or the exercise states that we have to compute the equivalent production or the unit output for the month for each of the following situations. When we now involve the solutions of chapter 5. So compute the equivalent production unit output for the month for each of the following situations. Now, letter A up to letter E. We are now given the units completed during the month, the units in process at the end of the month, and the stages of completion. So what we are going to do now is to compute for the equivalent production or the unit output for the month for each of these given situations. Okay? I'll pause for a while. Solusyon yan, hindi niya mo. Sige, let's start with E5-1. Compute the equivalent production or the unit output for the month for letter A. Units completed during the month, 10,000. Then units in process at the end of the month, stage work done is one half. Now take note that there is no beginning inventory given, but we are given the ending inventory. So first, we have to begin with completed during the month, 10,000, and then the ending inventory of 5,000 units. But the stage of work done is one half. Now, what we mean by one half completed is that each of the 5,000 units had been completed only up to one half stage. So, meaning all of the 5,000 units are not yet completed. In other words, the work done is only one half. So it does not mean that out of 5,000, one half is completed. No, it means that of the 5,000 units, each unit is not completed, but only one half work done. So, but if we convert the ending inventory in terms of completed units, only 2,500. But it does not mean that 2,500 units were completed. We have full 5,000 units in process at the end. And each of these units had been, work done had been one half. So we have 5 add to 10,000. The EP is 12,500. Now we go to letter B, units completed during the month, 22,000. And then we have the work in process at the end, 4,000 units. The work done is 3/4. So the total is 25,000. In letter C, units completed, 8,000. At the end of the month, you have 1,000 units, one-fourth completed, and 500 units, two-fifths completed. So you get 200 and 250. You add the work done during the period is 8,450. That's the equivalent production. Then in letter D, completed is 25,000 units. Then equivalent production of the work in process and 5,000 units, one half work done, and the other 5,000 units, three-fourths done. So we now get the total of 31,250. Then for letter E, we have now completed of 48,000 units, the equivalent production of the in process end with 1,500 units times 4/5, 1,200, and with 1,000 units, we have 4,000 units, one-fourth completed. So you now get 1,000. So the equivalent production is 50,200. Okay, now we go to problem number 2, computing unit cost. During the month, a company with no departmentalization incurred cost of 45,000 for materials, 36,000 for labor, and 22,500 for factory overhead. There were no units at the beginning of the period or at the end of the period, and 20,000 units were completed. Now, considering that you have no work beginning nor ending, meaning the units completed, that is also your equivalent production. So we have now to determine the unit cost for the month for materials, labor, and factory overhead, and the total unit cost. So we have now for the unit cost, we divide the production cost by the equivalent units for materials, labor, and overhead. So we now get the cost per unit of 5.175 cost per unit. Next, we go to 3, computing unit cost. The company recorded cost for the month, 18,900 for materials, for labor, and for factory overhead. There was no beginning work in process. 8,000 units were finished, and 3,000 units were in process at the end of the period. Two-thirds completed. Compute the month's unit cost for each element of manufacturing cost and the total per unit cost. So we now get in E53 the materials, labor, and factory overhead, the total of 89 to 50. Then the equivalent units of 10,000. How did we get 10,000? Units completed is 8,000 units. Then the work in process end is 3,000 units. Work done is only two-thirds. So you add 2,000 to 8,000. Your equivalent units of production is 10,000. So use 10,000 as divisor in determining your unit cost. So the cost per unit is 8.925. Next, we go to 5-4, computing equivalent units. This time, we have a beginning inventory. The company had 200 units in work in process at the beginning of the month. During the month, 7,500 units were started in production, 6,800 units of which, along with the beginning work in process, were completed by the end of the month. The uncompleted units were in ending inventory, one half complete. What were the equivalent units of production for the month? So first, you have to determine the number of units to be accounted for. The number of units to be accounted for, actually, you have 200 units in the beginning inventory and 7,500 units just started during the period. So if you have to determine the total number of units to be accounted for, it's equal to beginning inventory add units just started. The total units to be accounted for is 7,700. Now, how do we account for the units? The units completed during the month, uh, here, during the month, 7,500 units were started in production, 6,800 of which, along with the beginning work in process, were completed. So in other words, the total number of units completed during the period is 7,000. That's the sum of the beginning work in process and the units just started. So the units completed during the period is 7,000. Out of 7,700 units, the sum of 200 and 75, we have total of 7,700. Now, if the units completed is equal to 268, meaning the units completed is 7,000. And so the unit in the ending inventory is 700. So that what you will do is, first you have to determine the units to be accounted for. And normally, the units to be accounted for is the sum of the beginning inventory and the units just started. So, muna, no? Compute nyo. Beginning inventory, 200. Just started is 7,500. So, the total number of units to be accounted for is 7,700. It's not here. The total number of units to be accounted for is the sum of the beginning inventory and the just started. So you get 7,700. Out of these 7,700 units, 7,000 units were completed. 200 coming from the beginning inventory and 6,800 coming from the just started. Now, if the just started totaled 7,500 units and 6,800 were completed, in other words, the units in the ending inventory is 700. Okay? So the 700 units, the work done is one half as given the problem, so that your 700 times one half is 350. So we now get the total of 7,350. That's your total equivalent production. Okay? So the equivalent production is 7,350 units. Okay, now we are using here the average method. Take note that the beginning inventory, you are given 200 units, but you are not given the work done. So meaning we assume that once the units were completed during the period, the work done is 100%. So in other words, the 200 which were already in process beginning and the just started, the work done is assumed to be 100%. And only the ending inventory with the 700 units with the work done of one half. So you now get 7,350. We go to E5. E5 has the following requirements. Using the following data, determine which figures should be inserted in the blank spaces. So we have now the following columns: beginning units in process, units started in production, units transferred to finished goods, ending units, and equivalent units. Now remember the guide that I have given you, determining your equivalent units. First, we have to determine a beginning inventory, add units just started. So you have the units to be accounted for. And the units to be accounted for must equal the units accounted for. And the units accounted for is the sum of the units completed and the in process at the end. So I'll repeat, we have the units to be accounted for. The units to be accounted for is the sum of the beginning inventory and those just started. So beginning inventory and just started equals total units to be accounted for. Now, the total units to be accounted for should equal the units accounted for. And the units accounted for is the sum of the units completed and the in process at the end. So the total is total units accounted for. Now I'll repeat. The total units to be accounted for is the sum of the beginning inventory plus the units just started. Amo na ang total ya is the total units to be accounted for. And the units to be accounted for should tally with the units accounted for. So the units accounted for is the sum of the units completed and the units in process N. Okay, so we have now in letter A, blank are ending units and we have the equivalent units. So how do we compute now? We have the beginning units in the inventory, 600. Then the units just started, 800. So the total number of units to be accounted for is 8,600. That's total number of units to be accounted for. Now, the units transferred to finished goods, so meaning completed is 8,600. So meaning you have no ending units and here it's zero. So the equivalent units now is units completed during the month is 100% and you have no ending inventory. So the equivalent units is 8,600. So the answers to letter A, ending units in process, 0, equivalent units, 8,600. Next, letter B, units in process, 900, and the units started in production is 6,500. So the total units to be accounted for is 7,400. A units to be accounted for should equal the units in the ending inventory and the units completed. So if the units to be accounted for is 7,400 and you have 400 units in the ending inventory, meaning the units completed is 7,000. Units completed is 7,000, meaning 100%. And the ending inventory is 400 units. We multiply by 1/2, so you get 200. The equivalent units is 7,200. That's in letter B. And the units transferred to finished goods is equal to 7,000. So you fill in the blanks in letter B. Unit transferred to finished goods, 7,000. Equivalent units, 7,200. Then in letter C, units beginning 1,500. And we have now your unit started is blank. So actually, amoni ang missing. So what you will be doing is unit transferred to finished goods. You add to units end. So you now get 12,900 plus 1,200. You get total of 14,100. If you add 12,900 and 1,200, you get 14,100. And the beginning inventory of 1,500, so meaning you have the difference of 12,600. You have the unit started in production. Okay, if we stick to the formula that I gave you, that units in process beginning, and then we add just started, we get the total units to be accounted for. So that means we are going to add units in process beginning 1,500, but the unit started is not given. So, these total units to be accounted for cannot be determined now because you have a missing figure. So, you go to the next process, you add the units completed, you add to the ending inventory. That's now your units accounted for. So if you add 12,900 and 1,200, you get 14,100 units. These are the total number of units accounted for. And then you work back, you deduct the number of units in the beginning inventory of 1,500 units, 12,600 units. You have the units started. Okay? So if you want to check if 12,600 is correct, now you go back to the original formula I gave you. Units in process beginning of 1,500. Then you add the missing item which you have now computed of 12,600. So you get 14,100, the total number of units to be accounted for. 14,100. And it's now equal to 12,900 units completed and ending inventory of 1,200. So meaning you get 14,100. Adding 12,900 and 1, 2 still you get 14,100. Now, the missing items here are, we have your unit started in production, which we have already computed. You can have this alternative solution. Unit started in production of 12,600. And once you find it, you are now ready to determine your equivalent units of production. So units transferred, 12,900 given, assumed to be 100% completed. Then the ending inventory, 1,200 units, one-fourth completed. So you now get 1,200 times one-fourth equals 300. So you now get 13,200 is the equivalent units of production. So you can now fill in the blanks, 13,200 for the equivalent units, and the units started off 12,600. Next in letter D, missing is the work beginning and the equivalent units. So your again, you cannot compute for the units to be accounted for because the units beginning is not yet given. So what you are going to do, you begin with 7,200, add 150, you get 7,350. That's the number of units accounted for. Then you deduct 7,250, the difference, 100 units. That's your beginning inventory. So now determining if you are given your beginning inventory, you check 100 units, add 7,250. You get 7,350. So on the other side, 7,200 completed, the ending inventory is 7,350. Okay, so units completed, 7,200, and you have your ending units, inventory ending units of 150 times 1 half. So you get a total of 75. So what will be your equivalent production? Units transferred to finished goods, 7,200. And then we have the ending inventory multiplying 150 by 1 half. So now you get equivalent units of 7,275. Next, letter E, again, missing is the beginning inventory, and then you are given the unit started. The ending inventory, 8,200. You add the ending inventory of 2. Di na ko. Okay, we are still in letter E. Units beginning, missing, and then just started 8,400. The ending inventory is 200 units. We add to the units completed of 8,200, so you get 8,400. Where you deduct here 8,400 is the just started, meaning you have no beginning inventory. So the equivalent units transferred or completed 8,200. Then the ending inventory of 200 units times 1/2 is 100. So the equivalent units is 8,300. Letter F. We have now beginning inventory 400 units, and then we have 6,200. So the total is 6,600. That's your units to be accounted for. Then the units completed 6,200. The ending inventory is 400 units. So for the equivalent units, you are given 6,300. The units transferred to finished goods, 6,200, meaning the equivalent units of the ending inventory is 100. To complete the difference between 6,300 and 6,200. So the equivalent ending units in process, we have 100. The actual number of units is 400, meaning the work done on the inventory end is 1/4. You are not given, but you can compute 100, and we have to divide by 400. So you have 25%. Now we go to E5-6, computing unit cost. The records of Boris Incorporated reflect the following data. Work in process, beginning of the month, 2,000 units, 1/2 completed at a cost of 1,250 for materials, 675 for labor, and 950 for overhead. Production costs for the month, materials, labor, and factory overhead. Units completed and transferred to stock, 38,500. Work in process at the end is 3,000 units, 1/2 completed. Compute the month's unit cost for each element of manufacturing cost and the total per unit cost. So in E5-6, the beginning work in process, you are given the cost of each element. Total is 2,875. Then the cost during the month, again, you are given the cost of each element. So the total is 229,125 for the total cost of materials, labor, and factory overhead. Then the equivalent units for this is equal to 40,000. How we compute for 40,000? The units completed is 38,500, and the ending inventory of 3,000 units, 1/2 completed. So you get 1,500. So the equivalent units of production is 40,000. We divide the total cost by 40,000. We now get your unit cost, and the average unit cost is 5.80. Next, we go to number 7, computing unit cost. We have the records of Stone Incorporated reflect the following data. Work beginning of the month, 4,000 units, 1/4 completed at a cost of 2,500 materials, labor 1,400, factory overhead is 1,800. Then we have now the cost for the month for materials 130,000, labor 70,000, factory overhead 82,000, the total cost of 282,000. Then we get the total cost for the beginning inventory and the cost for the month, total of 287,700, and the equivalent units of 47,500. Now the units completed and transferred for 45,000, that's completed, and the ending inventory of 5,000 times one half. So you get the equivalent units of production of 47,500, and that will be your divisor in computing the unit cost. So we now get the average unit cost of 6.056. Next, we go to problem 8. Okay, we are still on exercise number 8, computing unit cost. The company had 500 units, 3/5 completed in the beginning of the month. During the month, 2,000 units were started and finished. There was no work in process at the end of the month. Unit cost production for the month was 1.20. Cost materials, labor, and overhead incurred in the current month totaled 2,655. Calculate the unit cost for the prior month. Hint, you must first determine what the dollar balance in work in process must have been at the beginning of the month, as well as the equivalent production of the units in beginning inventory. So we have now the units in process at the beginning of the month, 500, and then we have just started for 2,000. The units completed during the month is 2,500. Now, 2,500 units completed during the month, and the production cost is 120. That's for unit cost of production for the month, 1.20. And in the current month, cost of materials, labor, and factory overhead incurred in the current month totaled 2.6, 2,655. Take note that you are given the unit cost of production for the month of 1.20. So you multiply that by the equivalent production of 2,500. That will give you 3,000. Now, as given, the unit cost of production for the month and the cost for materials, labor, and factory overhead incurred in the current month total. So we calculate the unit cost for the prior month. So 3,000 credited to work in process at the end of the month. 2,655 debited to work in process during the month, as we have the costs incurred during the month. And we have the balance of 345. That's the balance in work in process at the beginning of the month. So in other words, this 120 is the unit cost of production for the month. But we have the actual cost of 2,655. So which is debited to work in process, while the 120 is credited. We have the balance in the work in process at the beginning of the month equal to $345. There are no units at the end of the month. So there would be no balance remaining in the work in process at the end of the month. 500 units, 3/5 completed at the beginning of the month equals the equivalent production of 300 fully completed units. So 345 here minus 3 divided by 300 beginning inventory. So we now divide and get 1.15. That's the unit cost for the prior month. Considering that you have this 345 applicable to the beginning inventory, and the equivalent production of the beginning inventory is equal to 300. So you get the unit cost for the prior month equal to 1.15. Next, we go to E59, computing unit cost for department and for completed units. Incorporated as two production departments, the nature of the process is such that no units remain in process in finishing at the end of the period. At the beginning of the period, 10,000 units with a cost of $30,000 were transferred from assembly to finishing. Finishing incurred cost of materials, labor, and overhead, and finished 10,000 units. So we have now total units completed of 10,000 units. That's the output. Now, the production cost given for materials, labor, and overhead, and transferred from the assembly, since we begin from the assembly department and transferred to the finishing. So we have now the total cost in this department, then we add the cost from the assembly department, the total cost of 54,800. And we have the unit output of 10,000. So we now get the cost per unit of 2.48. And from the previous department, it's 3. So meaning it's 5.48 as required in letter A. Determine the unit cost for the month in the finishing department. And B, the unit cost of the products transferred to the finished goods. So that's the sum of the finishing department's cost and from the assembly. So we now get 5.48. Next, we have number 10. Required is using the data in E59, prepare a statement of cost of goods manufactured for the months ended January 31, 2016, assuming that no further work was done in assembly during January. So we now begin with materials given for 8,800, and then labor 7,200, factory overhead 8,800, total manufacturing cost 24,800. We add the work from the first department of 30,000, the total work cost of 54,800. No ending inventory, so the cost of goods manufactured is 54,800. Next, we go to E511, computing unit cost for department and for completed units. Alpine incorporated as two production departments. The nature of the process is such that no units remain in process in finishing at the end of the period. At the beginning of the period, 15,000 units with a cost of $25,000 were transferred from immersion to finishing. Finishing incurred cost of $6,000 for materials, $9,000 for labor, and $12,000 for factory overhead, and finished 15,000 units during the month. Determine the unit cost in the finishing department and the unit cost transferred to the finished goods. So in number 11, we begin with the cost in the finishing department, dividing production cost by the output. So you now get 1.80. That's the average unit cost in the finishing department. Then we have to add the total cost from the first department, the immersion department. We get the unit cost of 1.67, giving the total unit cost, or this is now your cost of the products transferred to the finished goods. So we now have 3.47 in number 11. Next, we go to number 12. Using the data in E511, prepare a statement of cost of goods manufactured for the month ended January 31, assuming that no further work was done in immersion during January. So we now add the cost of materials, labor, and factory overhead, total manufacturing cost. Then we add the work in process beginning. We now get the total cost of goods placed into process, no inventory end. So we now get your cost of goods manufactured during the month. Next, identifying cost flows in process cost system. List in columnar form the transactions and the accounts debited and credited to reflect the flow of costs through a process cost accounting system for the. So in number one, we are now going to, on the left side, we have the transaction, purchase of materials and supplies on account. We now debit to materials and credit to accounts payable kay on account. Then letter number two, issuance of materials and supplies for the factory. So we now debit to work in process for each department, for direct materials, then debit to factory overhead for indirect materials or factory overhead control. That may be your alternative account for the actual indirect materials cost. So our credit is materials. Then for letter number three, factory labor cost distributed. So we now debit to work in process for direct labor, debit to factory overhead or factory overhead control for indirect labor, and credit now to wages payable, or maybe if we already had a previous entry recording payroll, credit wages payable, then here we could have a credit to payroll. So wages payable or payroll. Next, other factory costs incurred. So debit to factory overhead or factory overhead control, and credit to various accounts. Meaning you may credit for depreciation, credit to accumulated depreciation, for insurance, you credit to prepaid insurance. Now that's what we mean by various accounts. Next, distribution of factory overhead to departments for number five. So we have to debit to factory overhead, credit, debit factory overhead, no? For each department that you have to distribute to each department. So you now credit to factory overhead. You may be closing factory overhead if you are now distributing to the various departments. So you may debit factory overhead control and credit it again. However, if you have to record your factory overhead applied, then you debit to work in process and credit to factory overhead applied, or simply factory overhead. Then we have the units transferred from one department to another. That's now your transfer of units from one department to another, we have now to debit to work in process, credit work in process of the transferring department. Now you assume that you are involving two different departments. One is the receiving, the other one is the transferring. Then for the units completed in number 8, we now debit to finished goods and credit to work in process in the last department. And finally, for the units sold, we debit to accounts receivable or cash and credit to sales. And then you also debit to cost of goods sold and credit to inventory. Now, for your credit, sales and finished goods or finished goods inventory. Now we go to problem 14. 14. Reasons for change in unit cost. Note that on page 267, when Coronado Chemical Company operated as a single department, its cost per unit to produce the specialty chemical was $16. When it subsequently divided operations into three departments, its unit cost totaled 16.50, mixing 10, blending 250, and packaging 4. What are some of the reasons as to why this increase in unit cost may have occurred? So we have now in problem 14, when three departments instead of one, the company would now have additional fixed costs such as the salaries of the three department managers instead of one. It was not stated in the chapter, but they may have needed additional space for the three departments, resulting in more depreciation expense, maintenance, and utilities. Perhaps with its business growing, the company produced more than the original single specialty chemical. If so, the new products could have had higher materials and labor costs per unit. We do know that volume increased, but perhaps any decrease in labor cost per unit, uh, any decrease in profit per unit was more than made up for by higher total revenue and profit. We go to P515. In E5, 15, computing unit cost for department and for completed units with beginning inventory. Chavez Concrete Incorporated has two production departments. Blending had 1,000 units in process beginning, two-fifths complete. During the period, 7,800 units were received from mixing, 8,200 units were transferred to the finished goods storeroom, and 600 units were in process at the end of the period. So if you now consider the units to be accounted for, in the blending department, we have 1,000 units and 7,800 units. Now let's stick to the formula that I gave you. So the units to be accounted for in the blending department, the units beginning 1,000, and then we have the units received from mixing. So to be accounted for is 8,800 units. Now, what happened to the 8,800 units? The units completed and transferred to the finished goods storeroom, 8,200, and in the ending inventory of only 600 units. So the total number of units is 8,800. The ending inventory of 600 units, one-third complete. Now, we have the cost in the mixing and in the blending and the cost during the month. And we have the cost received from mixing, and we have now the cost in blending. So the requirements: determine the unit cost for the month in blending, determine the total cost of the products transferred to the finished goods. C, determine the total cost of the ending work in process inventory in blending. So first we have to begin with letter A. Actually, we have three requirements here: A, B, and C. So in A, we have to determine the unit cost for the month in blending. The beginning work in process inventory. We have now the cost of the beginning work in process was. So we have now the beginning work in process. We have materials, labor, and factory overhead, total of 1,000. And then the cost for the month as given, the cost during the month where materials, labor, and overhead, total of 20,000. So the overall total of 21,000. The equivalent units is, now we are talking about the blending department. The equivalent units is 8,400. Now the units completed during the months as given, 8,200. And then we have the ending inventory of 600 units, but the work done is only one third. So you get 200 units here. The total units of equivalent production is 8,400. That will be our divisor in determining the cost per unit. So we have now the cost per unit as required in letter A. That's the unit cost in the blending department with this supporting computations. Now in letter B, determine the total cost of the products transferred to the finished goods. So we have now the cost in the mixing for 8,200 units. Now 8,200 units were transferred from the mixing department. Now here, we are asked to determine total cost of the products transferred to finished goods. Now, the 8,200 units were transferred to finished goods storeroom. We now multiply 8,200 units and we multiply it by 10 per unit. 10 per unit is now the result of dividing the cost from the mixing department. That's from 8,200 units completed. And then how do we get 10? Dividing 78,000 by 7,800 units that were transferred from the mixing to the blending department. Okay, so we now get the cost taken by dividing 78,000 by 7,800 units. So by 7,800 units, we are now given the cost in mixing for 10,000 and as well as our cost in blending. And the cost during the months where the cost of goods received from mixing. So we have now 78,000, the cost in received from mixing in relation to 7,800 units that the mixing department transferred to blending. So meaning the average cost per unit is 10. Now you multiply 8,200 times 10. That's from the mixing up to the blending. So you now get 82,000. And we add the cost in blending of 8,200 times 250. 8,200 times 250. So you get now the total cost of goods transferred to the finished goods stockroom. So take note that during the period, 7,800 units we received from the mixing. But you have your ending inventory equal to 600 units. But take note that you had a beginning inventory in the blending equal to 1,000 units. It's understood that these 1,000 units, which are now in the blending department, originally came from the mixing. So from the mixing to the blending department. So that's why we are dividing 78,000 by 7,800 units received from the mixing. But the 1,000 units which are now in the blending department initially came from the mixing department. That's why we are using the average unit cost of 78,000. So we have now 82,000. Add cost in blending of 2,500. The cost of goods transferred to the finished goods is 102,500. Now that's the cost of your completed units. Then the last requirement, determine the total cost of the ending work in process in the blending. So we have now the cost in the mixing. Take note that the number of units to be accounted for is 8,800. Only 8,200 were completed. So in other words, the 600 units are in the ending inventory. But initially, they came from the mixing. So gani nga ang 600 nga ini halin man ini sa mixing. So the average unit cost of 10, you get 6,000. And then the cost in blending, you are now given materials, labor, and factory overhead. We have now the cost in blending. So we have to get the cost and take note that the work in process at the end is 1/3 completed. So we multiply the materials, labor and factory overhead, then 600 units times 1/3. Or you can simply multiply 200, that's equivalent production, 200 multiplied by the average cost per unit of 0.42, 1.25, and 0.83. These are your average cost per unit. Now in the blending department. So you get your cost of the work in process inventory of 6,500. That's in your blending department. Next, we go to problem 16 as to how many requirements. Problem 16, what are the requirements? Cost of production summary and journal entries. Using the data in E5-15, prepare a cost of production summary for the month ended January 31 and prepare journal entry to transfer the cost of the completed units from the blending to the finished goods stockroom. So in other words, in problem 15, these are the data that we are going to use in answering problem 16. So we now have the cost production summary, or sometimes we call this the cost of production report. Take note that in number 16, we are asked to prepare a cost production summary for, actually, it's for the blending department. So we have to start with the cost of work in process at the beginning of the month. This is now the cost related to the 1,000 units. Now take note that we have now the 1,000 units at the beginning of the period in the blending department, but actually this came from the mixing initially. Now we have the cost in the mixing department of 10,000. We are going to add the cost added in the blending department of another 1,000. The total cost applied to the beginning inventory of 11,000. Then we have the cost of goods received from the mixing during the month. So actually, we have to account for beginning of 1,000 units. And here we have 7,800 units. Now, what are the costs? We have a 10 times 7,800 units, so you get 78,000. Then we have the cost of production for the month in the blending. Given our these materials, 3,328 labor, 10,000 and factory overhead, 6,672. The total cost to be accounted for is 109,000. So the total cost to be accounted for 109,000. So the unit output for the month, finished and transferred to finished goods, 8,200 units. Inventory is 600 units. Work done is 1/3. So you get only 200. The equivalent production is 8,400. Now we have the material unit cost as computed 0.42125 for labor and factory overhead of 2.50. So we have now the cost of goods finished and transferred to finished goods, 8,200 units at 10. This was shown in E5-15. So we have now the cost in blending, total 102,500. So we have the cost of the work in process and 600 units at 10, and in the blending only 1/3 work. So you now get total of the total production cost 109,000. Total production cost accounted for should tally with total cost to be accounted for. So gani may to be accounted should be accounted. So meaning ang to be kag ang accounted must equal. In the same way that with regards to the units, your total units to be accounted for should tally with the units accounted for. So in this problem, the units to be accounted for is the sum of the beginning inventory in the blending of 1,000 units, and then you add your units received from the mixing department of 7,800. So the total is 8,800 units. Now, how do we account for the units? Completed is 8,200 and the work in process at the end of 600. So, total units to be accounted for should tally with the units accounted for. In the same way that your total cost to be accounted for should tally with the total cost accounted for. The journal entry to transfer the cost of the completed units from the blending to the finished goods stockroom. We now debit to finished goods, 102,500, and credit to work in process blending. Now we have the next problem, 17. Computing unit cost for department and for completed units with beginning inventory. Micromotors has two production departments, finishing and 2,000 units in process at the beginning of the period, 3/5 complete. During the period, 14,000 units were received from assembly, 13,000 units were transferred to the finished goods storeroom and 3,000 units were in process at the end of the period, two-thirds complete. If you want to determine the units in the quantity schedule, units to be accounted for is equal to 2,000 units plus 14,000. So 2,000, that's your beginning inventory, and then we add 14,000 units received from assemblies. So the total units to be accounted for is 16,000 units. With the 16, what happened to the 16,000 units? 13,000 units were transferred to the finished goods stockroom, meaning they were already completed, and the 3,000 units are in process inventory at the end. So determine the unit cost for the months in finishing. That's the last department. Determine the total cost of the products transferred to finished goods and the cost of the ending work in process inventory. So for requirement letter A, we have now the beginning work in process. So we have now your cost. Total is $3,000. Then the cost for the month for materials, labor, and factory overhead for the total of 29,400. And so the total of 5,400, labor 16,500, and factory overhead of 10,500. So the total of 32,400. For the equivalent units, we have now 15,000 units completed and transferred, 13,000, and 3,000 units in process at the end, but only two-thirds completed. So your equivalent units of production is 15,000. That will be used in dividing your material costs, labor costs, and factory overhead costs in finally arriving at your cost per unit of 2.16. So here we have the computation of your equivalent units of production. Okay, letter B, determine the total cost of the products transferred to finished goods. So we now get the cost of in assembly 13,000 units times 6. That's taken by dividing 84,000 divided by 14,000. So it means it's at 6 per unit. Given is 84,000 here, and we divide it by 14,000 units received from assembly. So from the assembly department, you have the cost per unit of uh, 6. So dividing 84,000 by 14,000. So you get 6. You multiply cost in assembly, 13,000 units by 6. Here we have assembly, finishing, the cost per unit is 2.16. Now in this department, so you now get 78,000 and 28,000. You have the cost of goods transferred to the finished goods. So this is now the cost of your completed units. Now the cost in assembly, we have 3,000 times 6 using this. So you now get the cost in finishing. For 18,000, we are given the cost of 18,000. From here, the cost in assembly taken by multiplying 3,000, the ending inventory times 6. taken from here. So we have the 6 per unit. So you get 18,000, and then we are given the cost in finishing with 36, 110, and 70. 3,000 units, and the work done is only two-thirds. So you now get the total cost of the work in process inventory. The cost of the finished goods, 106,080. And we have now your equivalent units. Now we still have 18. Let me see, 18, 19. How far can we go? Let's try to finish up to number 19. And we will have the problems tomorrow. At least by tomorrow, hopefully we can finish on chapter 5. Chapter 5, though chapter 6 is still a continuation of chapter 5. So hopefully by tomorrow I can finish lecturing on the problems so that by Friday we may begin with chapter 6, the continuation of process cost. Now we go to 18. As required, using the data in E517, prepare a cost production summary for the month of December for finishing, and prepare a journal entry to transfer the cost of completed units from finishing to the finished goods stock room. So in 18, we now get the work in process beginning. The cost is the cost in assembly, we are given 12,000, and the cost in finishing given are materials, labor, and factory overhead. Then we have the cost of goods received from assembly during the month given is 84,000. And we have the cost of production for the month in the finishing given materials, labor, and factory overhead. So the total of 128,400. The unit output for the month, finished and transferred to finished goods, 13,000. The work in process end, 3,000 units, two-thirds complete. So the equivalent production is 15,000 units. The unit cost for the month for materials, we are now adding 604,800 divided by 15,000, your equivalent production. So you get 0.36, labor 1.10, and factory overhead 0.70. So the total is $2.16. The inventory cost, the cost of goods finished and transferred to finished goods, the cost in assembly, 13,000 times 6, the cost in finishing, 13,000 times 2.16. Now we have the cost, the work in process inventory end of 3,000 units. It was a full cost up to the assembly department, but in finishing, it's only 3,000 units times two-thirds. So you multiply by the unit cost. 128,400 is here. That's the cost to be accounted for. So cost to be accounted for is finally accounted for, allocated to your cost of completed units and work in process at the end. Okay, now let's go to requirement 2, prepare journal entry to transfer the cost of completed units from finishing to the finished goods stock room. So we now debit to finished goods 106,080. That's the cost of completed units. And finally, credit to work in process in the finishing department. Now, the last problem, adjusted unit cost from prior department. The requirements are one, compute the adjusted unit cost from the prior department in the forming department. Two, based on the amount of the cost per unit of the inventory transferred compared to the cost per unit of the beginning inventory. Why might management want to do a cost study of the blanking department? So Charleston Can Incorporated has 1,000 units in process in forming at the beginning of the month with a transferred cost of 21,200 from blanking. During the month, 5,000 units with a total cost of $100,000 are received from blanking. So received from blanking is 5,000 units, and you have a beginning inventory informing of 1,000 units. So total units to be accounted for is 6,000. 4,000 units are finished and 2,000 units are in the ending inventory. Compute the adjusted unit cost from the prior department in the forming department, and based on the amount of the cost per unit of the inventory transferred compared to the cost per unit of the beginning inventory. Why might management want to do a cost study of the blanking department? So we now begin with requirement number one, the adjusted unit cost. So we now compute for beginning inventory 1,000 units, transferred in this month 5,000 units, so the total of 6,000 units. The cost carried from the blanking department of 21,200 and transferred in during the month with carried cost of 100,000. So 121,200 divided by 6,000 units. The adjusted unit cost from prior department is $121,200 divided by 6,000 units. So you now get an average unit cost of $20.20. The units transferred to finishing and the number of units in ending work in process have no effect on this solution. Okay, requirement two, based on the amount of the cost per unit of the inventory transferred compared to the cost per unit of the beginning inventory. Why might management want to do a cost study of the blanking department? Last month, the manufacturing cost per unit in blanking was 21.20, dividing 21,200 by 1,000 units. This month, it was only 20, dividing 100,000 by 5,000, a decline of 5.7%. Blanking may have initiated the new cost-saving manufacturing techniques that could also be utilized by their other manufacturing departments. So we have now your problem E6-19, no? Anyway, I'll just continue with one more problem. Problem 5-1. 5-1 is here, a cost production summary or report. At Geneva Products produces latex paint and uses the process cost system. Materials, labor, and overhead are added evenly throughout the process. The following information was obtained from the company's accounts at the end of February. So we have now the cost incurred during the month for materials, labor, and factory overhead. And we have now the production report for finished and transferred to stockroom 60,000 units, and in the ending inventory of 10,000 units. So in other words, you have total units to be accounted for of 70,000 units. So for our cost of production report, the cost of production for the month, we have materials, labor, and factory overhead, total of 90,000. Then we have the unit output for the month, finished and transferred to the finished goods, stock room during the month, 60,000. The ending inventory, though it's 10,000 units, but only one-fourth completed. So your total equivalent production is only 62,500 units. The unit cost for the month, we are now dividing materials by the EP, labor, and factory overhead. You are now dividing your factory overhead given at 40,000. So you get the average unit cost of 1.44. Now for the inventory cost, we have this cost of goods finished and transferred to the finished goods during the month, 60,000 units times 1.44. How did we get this 60,000 units completed? It's given in the problem. So you multiply this by 1.44, and then the work in process at the end of the period, 10,000 units times one-fourth. And we multiply each of this by the corresponding unit cost. We have now the total production cost accounted for equal to 90,000. Take note, the total cost to be accounted for is also 90,000. Total cost to be accounted for. Okay, and you have here the cost to be accounted for is equal to the cost accounted for. Okay, so we will have the following problems by tomorrow. I'll discuss 5-2. That's the cost of production with one department. There's a beginning in process inventory in 5-2. Then we have 5-4, computation of equivalent units. Now in 5-5, we have the cost of production now in multiple departments. There is no beginning inventory. Then we have 5-5, 5-7. This is quite a long problem. 5-8 involving journal entries. Now take note that in 5-7 we have multiple departments, same with 5-6. Okay, so 5-7 and 5-8 we work on a longer problem. Here 5-10. Oh, it's quite preparing journal entries. 5-9 and 5-10 and 5-13R. So far, this is the last problem, and we have the mini case. So hopefully I can lecture tomorrow, and you again open your YouTube in the evening for the discussions of the remaining problems in chapter 5. Okay na?